Hi everyone, my name is Abby Boggs. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you of course to Hope and to Pam and Janet and Anne and the rest of the BCRW staff, everyone in the back doing all the work with registration, AV people, etc. Also of course to Atia and Catherine who invited us all to be here, and to Karen and Interpol for writing the book around which this all is formed. So our group is the Global Transformations Group, which means we had a prompt to think about questions of the global and what does kind of transnational feminist approaches or transnational feminist theory do for our thinking about that. We met yesterday and talked for the morning for a couple hours about individual papers we submitted, and that now we're going to kind of extend those a little bit and then hopefully kind of open our conversation up for you all. So we all kind of thought about the global through our own kind of research. And here's what I came up with. As the prompt for our group suggests, global conditions have undergone a range of transformations since Interpol Greywall and Karen Kaplan collaboratively assembled Scattered Hegemonies as a collection to, quote, broaden and deepen the analysis of gender in relation to a multiplicity of issues that affect women's lives. Now, while transformations that manifest on the global scale are perhaps rendered best or most apparent through analysis of regional and national economies or the politics of war, it seems worth questioning how these transformations also contribute to the shifting conditions of knowledge production within US higher education, which is the site of my own work. In this brief piece today, and with my panel, I'd like to consider the question of the global and the practice of transnational feminism as they pertain to the institutions through which much of this work transpires and in which many of us are located, or at least engaged, and actually where we currently are, US universities and colleges. So my own research and writing works to bring the insights of transnational feminist practices and theorizations, such as those exemplified in Scattered Hegemonies, to bear on the emerging field of critical university studies. My primary research project is an investigation into how ideas about the recruitment and education of international students, and especially international students who are coded as or understood as non-white in the US, has contributed to the emergence of the transnational neoliberal university as a decidedly and historically global institution. With only a few notable exceptions, critical university studies as a field has failed to seriously engage the question of how US higher education is, and historically has been, constituted in relationship to geopolitics and the transnational movement of people, capital, and ideas. In a similar vein, discussions of gender and frequently race, ability, and citizenship status remain peripheral if and when they're addressed at all. The field, some of you might have seen this piece, this kind of field establishing piece that came out in the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2012, authored by Carnegie Mellon comparative literature professor Jeffrey Williams, entitled Deconstructing Academe, a New Wave of Criticism of Higher Education, in which he talks about this new wave of higher education that's come about, or higher education studies, that's come about in the last 20 years, and takes an oppositional approach to the discourses and practices of universities, pushing against the uses of the university that place it and the knowledge produced within it at the service of power and wealth, rather than something like social hope, which is what Williams would like to see kind of critical university studies engaging. So according to Williams, this school of thought is best exemplified by Bill Redding's 1996 book, The University in Ruins, which suggests that shifts in the function of North American universities are symptomatic of the decline of the nation state, right? That the nation state is no longer a viable way of understanding economics, the social kind of world. Redding argues that the university is becoming, quote, a different kind of institution, one that is no longer linked to the destiny of the nation state by virtue of its role as a producer, protector, and inculcator of an idea of national culture. In other words, he contends that under the phase of global capitalism dominant in the 1990s when he was writing, the nation state is no longer has a stake in the types of students produced by its higher education system. As a result, US universities have shifted from being nationalist institutions focused on the production of proper citizens. Instead, they're becoming capitalist ventures, primarily interested in profit margins. Now, I would argue that this is sort of a reductive understanding of the mutually constitutive work of logics of the nation state and corporate capitalism, which is clearly out of sync with the premise of a transnational approach to feminist analysis that seeks to identify the continuities and discontinuities between multinational corporate strategies and dominant nationalist agendas, right? That in fact these things work together, so as to assume that all of a sudden the university has no stake or the nation state has no stake in the students it's producing is an odd argument to make. So What then might be gained by a critical engagement with the university that does not assume that the nation state is in decline and instead insists on a theoretical and historical approach to studying the university that seeks to account for the implications of the university and various racialized, gendered, sexualized, and global projects of state and capital? It is hardly a coincidence that several of the key scholars associated with the field of transnational feminist cultural studies have spent significant time, pages, and hours thinking reflexively about the field of women and gender studies, especially through the process of the field's institutionalization and kind of an ongoing institutionalization. So edited collections such as these two by Joan Scott, The Women's Studies on the Edge, and Robin Wiegman's Women's Studies on Its Own have done important work in providing timely and necessary insights about the process through which feminist scholars and their work have been incorporated into the university. While these texts necessarily contend with the broader politics and form of the university, their primary kind of object of inquiry is women and gender studies, rather than the broad university. So critical university studies has actually a lot to gain from these fields, but can also expand, I think, some of their insights. So I'm intrigued by the work that foregrounds higher education and a critical genealogy of the university and its entanglements with various global processes and movements. So for instance, I'm really excited by work that might be inspired by Craig Stephen Wilder's fantastic book that just came out earlier this year, I believe, or late last year. It historicizes the relationship between institutions of higher education, settler colonialism, and slavery in Ebony and Ivory. This work is significant not only because it exposes the violences of the past, though of course that is an important thing to do, but it is also important for the work it does in helping us, those of us working in the US university today, to grapple with the logics and knowledges that undergird the structures and politics of the spaces we're currently in and the policies we're currently contending with, right? We have to deal with these policies come from places, and it comes specifically out of this history, and we actually need to deal with that. Another article that I found especially kind of inspiring for my work is Grace Hong's 2008 piece, Feminisms of Our World, Black Feminisms and the Politics of Knowledge in the University Under Globalization. Here, Hong returns to a 1993 piece by Barbara Christian and contemplates the material, institutional, and intellectual future of Black feminism as a field and Black feminists as scholars. Christian warns of a future wherein the university's fetishization of Black women's bodies and intellectual production colludes with the university's systematic violences against Black women. Christian, and Hong following her, suggests that it's necessary to think about the ways the university is a productive and destructive space, right? A figural space and a literal space of life, but also of death. Importantly, Hong diverges from many of the central works of critical university studies by situating the violences against Black women in an explication of the role of the Western European University in the dissemination of epistemologies of Western civilization from which globalization has materialized. In so doing, Hong demonstrates the necessity for a transnational feminist understanding of the processes, histories, and effects of the US university that is attentive to the particular lived realities of its inhabitants, including all of us. Such an approach to thinking the global and the feminist in the university holds great potential for contesting, or at least contending with, the current transformation of the university into a newly, not new, but a global university, right? It's always been global, but this is a kind of a new instantiation of how that's working. So as the romantic and celebratory rhetoric of the global university reaches an even higher pitch, which I think we're all surrounded by in here, I'd argue that it is increasingly imperative that those of us invested in analyzing the, quote, uneven and heterogeneous processes through which transnational feminism turn our critical eye on the university itself. As this conference and space evidence, feminist knowledges are produced, imported, exported, packaged, and transmitted through the university, through the rapidly internationalizing neoliberal university. While the idea of the neoliberal or global university is only now gaining currency as a knowable entity, the logics, strategies, and tactics undergirding this phenomenon clearly build on a much longer history, on processes, and one that employed feminism within its arsenal of incorporative, depoliticized multiculturalism, right? The feminists kind of get foregrounded in that process. So when the category of women, or even gender, or feminism, is invoked in reference to the international and sometimes, and actually increasingly, the transnational, by state officials or by university administrators, often together in concert, we're all too often confronted by the most dangerously universalizing versions of women. Thus, there's a stark, though not novel, contradiction between the ways and ends for which women and gender studies is so often deployed as a public signifier alongside women in development or gender and development work, and the public face of the inclusive university, and the array of critical scholarly work that travels under the sign of transnational feminist studies and embraces the object crisis or the subjectless critique within feminist scholarship, while remaining attentive to the material effects of our work rather than kind of clinging to some essential category of women, right? That we all know what a woman is, right? That's not what we're trying to do with this work. So while much of my work and writing focuses on the figuration of men who travel to the US for their degrees as either prospective model minorities, like Kofi Annan, for instance, or potential terrorist threats, so Sung Hui Cho, Mohammed Atta, Zaid Kateb, various kind of figurations of the scary international student. I've also written on particular collaborations between the Hillary Clinton-led State Department and women's colleges. It seems in this space perhaps appropriate to talk about that. So these include Hillary Clinton, yes, there she is. These include the Women in Public Service Initiative, which Clinton describes as women in the world, women of the world, women for the world, and women who come together to support other women. This is from March 2011. And then the Next Scholars Program, which has a really special little, what's it called? Icon, sure. Notably with 2 chromosomes, right, 2 X chromosomes to signify the womanliness, the essential womanliness, which is an effort between the State Department and US colleges and universities to, quote, provide women from Muslim countries with a world-class education in science, technology, and engineering and math. This is from December 2011, which is interestingly timed just after kind of all the Benghazi stuff, right? It's also completely unfunded. The students get no money. They apply directly to the universities, and then they get a STEM sister, it's called, where they get another student at the university who gets the prestige of being a Next scholar. So these efforts build on a tradition of international engagement by US women's colleges and universities. For instance, in 2007, Joanne Crichton, the president of Mount Holyoke, insisted on the, quote, on the robustness of women's colleges because of their formative role in, quote, propelling women forward both in the US and in the world at large. Though she lamented the naivete and chauvinism of some early efforts to send emissaries out to do good, she applauds the current missionary spirit of successive generations of graduates, specifically those who have founded schools internationally, so continuing this educative process. In 2008, not long after Crichton's declarations, the New York Times ran an article entitled, "Sister Colleges See a Bounty in the Middle East," on the recruitment efforts of the 5 leading women's colleges, Bryn Mawr, Barnard, Mount Holyoke, Wellesley, and Smith, schools many of us are associated with. Not myself personally, but yet. So like Crichton, the article highlights that while single-sex schools in the Middle East are protected environments reflecting women's traditional roles in Muslim society, American women's colleges are alternative spaces despite their white-gloved history. They are liberal strongholds where students fiercely debate political action, gender identity, and issues like heteronormativity. In their self-promotion, the sisters thus embrace international students and homo, queer, and in some instances, trans individuals to produce themselves as exceptionally modern spaces of inclusion and progress, but then happily capitalize on their status as women's colleges in efforts to work with families for whom they represent, quote, a compromise between the familiarity of home and an all-out plunge into American ways. So I'm not actually particularly interested in debating whether or not US colleges and universities in general, or women's colleges in particular, should be recruiting international students, or whether or not this practice is wholly instrumental or genuinely progressive or something else. There's certainly a need for these discussions, though I do hope that when and if they take place, that, as Neha will discuss, they're critically attentive to the current experiences of the individuals involved in these processes. And as I've tried to start to argue today, they also are kind of take into account the longer history of education as a global enterprise. What intrigues me about thinking about these programs, articles, and initiatives through a transnational feminist frame, while simultaneously undertaking the kinds of projects that other members of this group are doing while living and teaching in the university. I think that this holds real potential for imagining and ideally shaping the futures of our students, of our fields, for ourselves, and of our institutions. I think it's worth insisting that higher education, modes of theorizing, theoretical terminology, and the basic geographic frames through which we analyze the world, which you're going to hear a lot more about in a moment, that they can be useful, effective, and strategic through the animation of critical and ethical transnational feminist approaches to study. So I also, before I end, wanted to just thank Karen and Interpol for kind of inspiring all of us in the ways we're thinking and in the work that we're doing. So thank you all.
So I wanted to reiterate the thank yous to the conference coordinators, Janet, Catherine, and Atia, who invited us here, to Pam and BCRW, who got us here, and of course to Karen and Interpol for inspiring the conference and our work. So I'm shifting gears a little bit to the subject of my own research, which is HIV prevention programs funded primarily by the US government and disseminated in Francophone West Africa, which is a site that hasn't received as much attention as Southern Africa, in part because it's Francophone, so it's French-speaking and not English-speaking, and also because the HIV rates and the spread of the epidemic has looked a little bit different. But I still argue that precisely because it has been neglected in these discussions around HIV prevention, that they're important locations to consider. So U.S. funding to address HIV/AIDS globally has increased significantly since George W. Bush first enacted the U.S. Global AIDS Initiative, or the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is known as PEPFAR. PEPFAR targets 15 countries, 12 in sub-Saharan Africa. That was the initial 2003 legislation. And the U.S. government has since been the single largest donor to all international efforts around the treatment and prevention of HIV/AIDS globally. And PEPFAR has received the majority of all U.S. global health funding. So 77% of all U.S. global health funding went to HIV/AIDS in 2010. Global health funding. So since its inception, PEPFAR and its stipulations around HIV prevention have provoked intense controversy. In its first 5 years, PEPFAR legislation mandated that 20% of $15 billion in total funding be expended on prevention programs promoting the so-called ABCs. So the A is for abstinence, the B for be faithful, and C for condom usage, with particular mandated emphasis on abstinence and be faithful. The 2003 legislation renewing funding for PEPFAR under Barack Obama requires that the Global AIDS Coordinator, which is the office created to oversee PEPFAR, report to Congress if any host countries with a generalized epidemic spends less than 50% of HIV prevention funding on abstinence, delay of sexual debut, monogamy, fidelity, and partner reduction education. So transnational feminist approaches are instrumental in linking U.S. interventions around HIV/AIDS, epitomized by PEPFAR, to the rise of neoliberalism and Christian fundamentalism in the United States, as well as to the war on terror. They also help to track how U.S.-funded HIV prevention media disseminated in sub-Saharan Africa as moral imperative, humanitarian mission, and strategic necessity invokes a certain feminism and the name of women, because a great deal of these policies claim gender equity and improving the lot of women as its justification. They elucidate how HIV prevention efforts to instill proper behavior figure gendered Black bodies and sexualities, and by extension, heteronormative concepts of the family. They could help trace how such efforts reiterate and revise prior missionary and colonial public health interventions and their potent appeals to the modern and to modernity, which are often the grounds for their appeals, inclusion in the modern, or to modernity, and how post-colonial states have co-opted such interventions and appeals to serve their own interests. They can also assist in tracking how earlier media by U.S. activist organizations such as ACT UP and Grand Fury, and educational telenovelas circulating in Latin America, such as the 1969-71 Peruvian telenovela Simplemente Maria, or Simply Maria, have been reproduced and co-opted in sub-Saharan Africa in the social marketing of HIV prevention. Finally, they would impel attention to diverse effects of the media, its reception in communities targeted, the changes wrought on local film and television industries by US-funded, locally produced prevention messages, and the vulgar, satiric, and at times hilarious rejoinders to the moralism of dominant HIV prevention messages that circulate more locally. I cannot provide an overview of all this work today. We have only, I think it's 12 minutes is the limit. So, but by way of example and a way to contribute to ongoing work of really a diverse array of activists engaged in contesting and transforming the terms of HIV prevention, I wanted to focus briefly on a telenovela. It's called Sida dans la Cité, or AIDS in the City. It's actually before the Sex in the City show that here, but but it circulated widely throughout Francophone West and Central Africa. The organization that funded it claims that something like 70% of women in Côte d'Ivoire had seen at least one episode. So it received pretty wide. It was screened widely and it was viewed widely according to its producers. And I'm interested particularly in the third, the 2003 16-episode series, which received the bulk of its production financing from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, through Population Services International, or PSI, just prior to the dispersal of PEPFAR funding. So it was shot in Côte d'Ivoire by an Ivoirian director and features well-known Ivoirian actors. The 2003 series was comprised of 4 individual segments, each targeting specific groups, so pregnant women, truck drivers, polygamous men and women, and a newly affianced couple. And at that point, producers considered abstinence an impractical and ineffective technique of HIV prevention. But it's interesting how the Be Faithful, I'm interested in tracking some of the continuities and some of the disjunctures in HIV prevention pre and post PEPFAR, and the consistencies in HIV prevention messages funded by the US government. So the concept of risk groups and behaviors promotes new forms of surveillance, the identification of dangers necessitating new modes of interventions, including the production and dissemination of HIV prevention media itself. US government-funded HIV prevention media draws on social marketing techniques and its consumerist ethos to depict a desired behavior change as acceptance of personal responsibility, and produces and promotes neoliberal conceptions of free individuals, who Aiwa characterizes as, quote, induced to self-manage according to market conceptions of efficiency, discipline, and consumerism, close quote. So US government HIV prevention media relies on the techniques of social marketing, and this isn't a secret, and they publicly frame their prevention as utilizing these tools, and they publicize them as such. And social marketing provides health education in the form of commercial advertising that simultaneously promotes branded products or services, such as condoms or HIV testing clinics. Social marketing of behavior change has become the primary form of health education in sub-Saharan Africa and in most of the global south. By focusing on individual behavior change and on bolstering the production of consumers into commercial markets, HIV prevention media, such as AIDS in the City, promote the central tenets of neoliberalism to produce HIV itself as a problem to be resolved not through structural transformations, but through proper self-management. Structural adjustment policies epitomize neoliberalism of the latter part of the 20th and early 21st century, which Wendy Brown defines as, quote, a confusing signifier for unique governmental and social rationality, whose fundamental tenets include deregulation, marketization, privatization of all public goods, a forthright attack on the public sector, and the beginnings of casting every human endeavor and activity in entrepreneurial terms, close quote. As many have noted, the imposition of structural adjustment programs in sub-Saharan Africa and their mandated cuts in public spending, especially on health and education, have in fact intensified impoverishment, especially of women, and exacerbated the conditions linked to the spread of HIV. So this is something the World Bank acknowledges openly. This is also not a secret. It also sidesteps ongoing controversies around HIV treatment access to focus on the transformations that it represents as required: fidelity, monogamy, HIV testing, increased sympathy, acceptance of medical authority, condom usage, etc. So AIDS in the City elides any of these structural conditions, sidesteps controversies, and it encourages these measures in the name of the health of the individual to consolidate companionate marriage and the patriarchal family, with the companionate marriage figured as the modern and a refiguring of the traditional, what's coded as the traditional. So marriage and family, heteronormativity itself, serve as both the rationale and the reward for proper self-management. These efforts to recode conceptions of gender, sexualities, and family are particularly powerful, not only because of the amount of funding channeled into them and their widespread diffusion, but also because of the force of their appeal to feeling, to sentiment, health, life, and the modern. HIV prevention, articulated as urgently necessary transformation of harmful cultural norms, highlights what Ezekiel Kalapeni, Susan Craddock, and Jayati Ghosh identify as one of the central paradoxes of HIV education itself. HIV education HIV outreach campaigns are based implicitly on the notion of rational behavior. That is, that with new knowledge comes automatic adjustment in social or sexual practices. This approach elides the broader context of power relations, economic necessity, and resource limitations within which HIV transmission occurs. Such campaigns rely on the culture and behavior paradigm and on racist colonial stereotypes about African sexuality, so-called, as requiring rectification. Further, as Mark Eprick notes, in seeking to counter such racist representations, scholars have paradoxically reinforced another stereotype about so-called African sexuality: unsubstantiated claims that same-sex sexual relations are non-existent or alien to Africa. The insistence on the heterosexuality of so-called African AIDS has facilitated struggles against homophobia, especially in the global north, since, as Eprecht argues, gay rights activists can, quote, deflect prevalent blame for HIV/AIDS away from the homosexual lifestyle, a huge political achievement, close quote. However, in attempting to educate Francophone West African audiences about heterosexual HIV transmission, AIDS in the city risks reinforcing a stigmatizing logic in which certain lives are deemed expendable. For example, one segment, AIDS in the City names homosexuality, what it terms homosexuality, drug use, and sex work only through phobic disavowal. Early in the segment, Fatoumata, mère séropositif, or Fatoumata, HIV-positive mother, Fatou's husband, Joseph, a mechanic at the Abidjan transport company, dismisses a co-worker's efforts to organize around AIDS at their workplace, since AIDS is what he terms, quote, whores and fags business. How does that concern us? The editing of the scenes underscores the irony characteristic of the telenovela. What Joseph does not know, and what the viewer is aware of since the first scene of the segment, is that AIDS is definitely his concern. Fatou, his pregnant wife, agreed to take an HIV test during a prenatal appointment and has tested positive. The segment insists that locating the source of infection and attributing blame is useless. As a woman in Fatou's support group reminds another, what does it matter who infected whom? But the segment simultaneously persistently identifies Fatou as virtuous mother and wife, and therefore blameless victim. As such, she can be enlisted as mother into what Karen M. Booth, revising Lee Edelman, terms neo-imperial reproductive futurism, the project of protecting and caring for the fetus as epitome of the possibility of a future in whose name parents must change their behavior. Initially, Joseph vehemently refuses to test, as he tells Fatou, who comes to the house to convince him, or as he tells Jackie, who's an HIV counselor, who comes to the house, I don't need to test. I'm not a bum. I'm not a fag. I'm a respectable man who works hard to support his household. So I ask my wife to give me a child. What does she bring me? AIDS. To combat stigma and address fears around HIV testing, the series represents Fatou as carrier and reproducer not of AIDS, but of the child, an overdetermined gendered heteronormative trope for future and for life itself. In attempting to educate viewers about the importance of universal HIV testing, the narrative depicts Joseph's consent to test as a sign of his enlightenment and his successful education about HIV. His realization that HIV/AIDS affects even the, quote, respectable man reinforces the category of the virtuous normal, defined against the stigmatized categories of the non-respectable prostitutes, intravenous drug users, fags, or homosexuals, from whom the series carefully differentiates Fatou and Joseph. When Joseph finally agrees to test, he reiterates to the counselor, quote, I never imagined that my wife and I could be affected by this disease. I always thought that AIDS was a disease of prostitutes, homosexuals, and drug addicts. It's like an almost anxious reiteration, right? I'm not this category throughout this series. So finally, Fatou gives birth to a son. She rejects her mother's advice to provide traditional so-called medicine to the boy and instead carefully follows a nurse's instructions to avoid mother-to-child transmission of HIV. The series closes with Joseph and Fatou with their relatives and friends celebrating their son's 15 months birthday, portrayed as his symbolic rebirth, the day Joseph and Fatou learn that he is converted and is HIV negative. Rather than lead to death and destruction of the family, HIV-positive diagnosis enables reproduction, continuation of paternal legacy, and the role of HIV-positive women as mother, all attained through individual education, decision-making, and compliance with medical authorities and the corporation. The homo and fag, the prostitute, and the intravenous drug user are conspicuously cast outside the possibility of the redemptive narrative of education and behavior change. Prevention approaches that focus on securing women as mother in the patriarchal reproductive family might seem to indicate desirable cultural sensitivity, an often repeated phrase in HIV prevention efforts in sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, they may appear to reflect existing so-called African conceptions of tradition, family, gender roles, and reproduction, as well as methods of communication. However, such conceptions are not static, and this is something that I learned way back reading your book, Scattered Hegemonies, right? And that such cultural productions and prevention efforts do not merely reflect or integrate, but participate in ongoing conflicts and struggles around the definition of such conceptions. An understanding of the multiple, ambivalent, often contradictory meanings generated by the social marketing of HIV prevention would prove particularly useful contributions to transnational feminist challenges to behavioral approaches to HIV prevention. And it further broadens understanding of neoliberal technologies that manage and regulate, not only through economic, political, or military processes and practices, but also through seemingly humanitarian or so-called humanitarian public health media interventions into cultural norms.
So I'm going to shift gears again and move geographically as well, as my paper is called Building Women's Solidarity and Strengthening Transregional Connectivities in a Time of Economic and Political Crisis, the Case of Eastern Europe. In the introduction to the 1994 anthologies, Career Hegemonies, Iderpal Grevel and Karen Kaplan articulated the need for the visibility and connectivity of feminisms from various locations around the globe. They argue that it is impossible to analyze the situation in a globalizing world without understanding geopolitical circumstances of women's lives and the careful delineation of the, I quote, map of debates around cultural production and reception of the diverse feminisms around the globe. In the context of current dramatic transformations, political transformations in Eastern Europe and the Arab world, so-called Arab Spring and Ukrainian Winter, the economic crisis, re-emergence of nationalism, neoconservatisms, religious fundamentalisms, and the backlash against LGBT communities around the world, strengthening transnational connectivities and solidarities is particularly important. This paper examines 3 strategies of building transregional connectivities. 1, learning about the experiences of women from various locations without naturalizing cultural difference. 2, moving away from universalizing categories of East-West, South-North, post-colonial and post-socialist. And 3, recognizing new modes of social justice activism in the form of global or translocal assemblages. So I'm going to start with the first one, learning about the experiences of women from various locations. Examining the ambivalent effects that unfinished revolutions and failed transformations had on women in various locations can become a productive tool of comparing multiple, intersecting, and silent oppressions. For instance, while in the former state socialist countries, the transition to democracy and capitalism did not bring the expected results in the area of social justice, the case of the Eastern European transformations can serve as an example of how scattered hegemonies of global economic structures and local legacies of domination and legal oppression work in producing patriarchal backlash against women and LGBTQ rights. Here it is important to remember that the regions that I'm talking about are of course not fixed and homogeneous, and both in space and in time and in the way, the moment of transformation that they're in. So for instance, if you consider the case of Eastern Europe, it is important to remember that the transformation will look different in the country that was a satellite country like Poland and the post-imperialistic Russia, and at the same time the transformations are in a different moment. So some of them are completed, like that one of Poland that is now part of the European Union, and some are still unfinished, like in the case of Ukraine that we are experiencing right now. Over the last 25 years, activists in post-state socialist countries have been mobilizing against various hegemonic discourses that emerged and re-emerged during the transition, including that of neoliberalism, religious fundamentalism, nationalism, and racism. They use a variety of tools, from NGO organizations to supranational activism and street actions, to address issues such as lack of abortion rights, recent backlash against gender education, and anti-gay rights laws. Women from the region promptly responded to hardship that materialized with the transition from centrally planned economy, dismantling of public services, cutting the welfare services in the name of westernization of the economy, and the abandonment of notion of equal participation between women and men in politics and labor markets. Their responses many times resembled the ways women in the East and the South tackle similar issues. Recognizing and comparing the workings of scattered hegemonies within globalization processes can make a case for the relevance of post-colonial framework to Eastern European locations, and in return, Eastern European experiences of radical transformations to the ongoing political shifts eastward. The delineation of common effects that genealogies of nationalism and imperialism, Eastern and Western, had on women, including the complex trajectories of feminisms within anti-imperialistic movements, uneasy relationships with nations and religious fundamentalisms, the experiences of racism and transnational positionalities vis-a-vis West, can serve as a stepping stone for establishing transnational solidarities between the feminisms from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Such comparative analysis of gender aspects of Eastern European so-called Velvet revolutions and Arab Spring, along with the ongoing exchange between activists working in the social justice-related issues, can be a fruitful strategy to formulate transnational feminist responses to the radical economic and cultural transformations. And now to the point, the second point, moving away from universalizing categories. Clearly, the call for transnational feminist solidarity and comparative work across the regions cannot nowadays be separated from the discussion about global political shifts and re-examination of the politics of locations within the transnational context. We no longer live in a world in which globalization can be framed as an unidirectional process from west to east, nor it is the world that is post-Cold War world. The race of formations such as BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, mark the emergence of the new global alliances that change existing taxonomies of center-periphery, east and west, post-colonial and post-socialist, as well as existing supranational institutions such as the European Union or NATO. In the context of former Eastern European feminisms that emerged at the intersection of a number of global transformations, Russia and its descendants, the Soviet Union, as well as the Western European empires, are often considered to be examples of internal European imperialism that goes back to the 18th century. It also gives without saying that in the case of many Eastern European countries, such as Poland, the experience of war and of the post-war geopolitical order are themselves experiences of colonization, as they watched the country divided between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939, and then incorporated into Soviet Empire's sphere of influence after Yalta Conference in 1945. It is also worth noting that the Soviet system was not dismantled until 1989, which means some colonies within Europe achieved their independence 40 years after India and 27 years after Algeria. How are these complicated local legacies of European colonialism impede or encourage the collaborations between Eastern European feminists and other regions during the time of ongoing tragical transformations? Can they become entry points for connecting the experiences of women from Eastern Europe and the Global South? While much of the transnational feminist debate are still structured around and in relation to the problematic category of the West, we should now ask how the emergence of the supranational political bodies that blur and destabilize the existing geographical and symbolic boundaries between world's regions affect our positionalities and as transnational feminists. The so-called Second World, which is Eastern Europe, that occupies the ambivalent positionality between East and West, and that could potentially become a location in which such discussion could take place, remain largely absent from the transnational feminisms that emerge as a departure from the US-centric feminist knowledge production and as a critique of the homogenizing notion of the other woman. Existing constructions of post-socialism represent Eastern European society as uniformly on board with processes of westernization that exclude Eastern European space from the geography of critique of the West and the First World. Stereotypical images of the Eastern Europe that represent the region as failing to enter the process of modernization or as delayed in the process of modernization in comparison to the West also completely neglect the period of state socialism as a time when a mode of modernization that was alternative to the Western capitalism has been implemented also in the area of gender equality. State socialist project of women's equality that emerged from the work of the 19th century Eastern and Western feminists, such as Clara Zetkin, and was first and exclusively practiced by activists such as Alexandra Kollontai in the 1920s Soviet Union, remain unexamined as a source of linking resistances emerging from post-colonial contexts with those developed in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And the last part, recognizing the new modes of social justice activism. If the politics of location is to be utilized as, I quote, practice that investigates the productive tension between temporal and spatial theories of subjectivity, one has to consider both the working of the past legacies of local feminism and local feminism in contemporary transnational debates and an impact of current process of denationalization on the modes of transnational feminist organizing in various locations. Current trajectories of globalization cannot be conceptualized in terms of unidirectional structural transformations. Rather, they should be, following Stephen Collier and Aiwa Ong, described as a translocal assemblages that address the questions of globalization in a fragmented and limited manner. Translocal assemblages are the spaces of reflection and intervention that have no single origins, genealogy, and therefore remain unstable, scattered, and situated. Eastern Europe and the European Union are oftentimes considered crucial site of these new global arrangements. Although the EU is still weak in relation to renationalized European nation state, the strengthening of the European supranational bodies, such as European Human Rights Court, facilitate emergence of new political subjectivities within the EU. In response to the heterogeneous processes of globalization at the EU level, Eastern European feminists effectively practice activism that combine various localism and regionalism with the transnational efforts to provoke social, cultural, economic change and exchange. The activist responses to globalization processes are focusing on an effort to reconstruct and reconnect specific modes of economic expertise, one that is not based in free market economy, and various forms of activism that link feminism with anti-gentrification activism and urban and environmental activism. Particular attention is paid to this struggle. Particular attention in these struggles is paid to the significance of the non-traditional political spaces, such as streets, public spaces, such as bar, coffee shops, and squats, and the new political actors, such as LGBT movements, parental movements, and anti-eviction movements, as well as the ways in which technology can serve as a tool of representing NGOs as crucial actors in translocal politics. In the context of ongoing reframing of the experiences of globalization, in many Eastern European countries, particularly Poland, debates on women's bodies, the right to abortion, reproductive rights, and women's rights as migrants become instances of transforming non-political issues, so-called private issues, to political debates. Feminist activists ask how globalization becomes the process within individuals, how bodies are markers of geographical and symbolic boundaries, and how the body itself can be conceptualized as territory. In conclusion, feminist activists in Eastern Europe co-create institutions of political citizenship while moving away from existing binaries of West, East, Global South, and Global North, and by moving away from framing the global as universal and conceptualizing local as particular. The recognition of the hybridity of the so-called second world within transnational feminist framework could help us create more connectivities between the experiences of so-called second and so-called third world women, and thus alter and go beyond the paradigm in which post-state socialist women's writings and struggles arise solely in the context of and in response to Western feminisms. Thank you.
I also very much want to thank everybody from BCRW for organizing this conference and for inviting us. And also especially thank you to Interpol and Karen for being here today and for their work over many decades that has inspired us to come together today. So I'm also going to shift focus now to another region of the world, specifically Latin America and the Caribbean. So how might transnational feminisms help us analyze and respond to current global transformations? That was a prompt we were given to think about. To begin thinking about this question, I return to the work that inspired this line of questioning in our gathering today. Inderpol Graywall and Karen Kaplan's Scattered Hegemonies, Postmodernity, and Transnational Feminist Practices. How can the theoretical framework that they lay out in their introduction 20 years ago still provide a useful analytical lens for today's global transformations? What new theoretical tools and lenses might these transformations demand? From my perspective, informed by my work on formations of gender and sexuality in the Dominican Republic and in the Dominican diaspora, the book's title and concept of Scattered Hegemonies lays out tasks that seem to me as vital as they were 20 years ago. I think now, as much as then, do we, and I quote, need to articulate the relationship of gender to scattered hegemonies such as global economic structures, patriarchal nationalisms, authentic forms of tradition, local structures of domination, and legal juridical oppression on multiple levels, end of quote. Just citing from Scattered Hegemonies. Yet if scattered hegemonies aptly describe the specific tasks that thinking gender in different locations entails, including today, the term that provides the larger frame for apprehending the realities of 1994, postmodernity, now seems somewhat less pertinent. In 1994, Graywall and Kaplan suggested that, quote, a study of postmodernity offers feminists a complex dynamic model of social, economic, and political relations, end of quote, as well as being, quote, one of the most effective critiques of modernism and modernity, end of quote. This optimism about postmodernity's critical capaciousness, I believe, has mostly waned today. In fact, Inderpol Graywall's evaluation of postmodernity in her book, important book, Transnational America, Feminisms, Diasporas, Neoliberalism, seems to have dampened too when she asserts that, quote, the history of modernity as of postmodernity was still informed by histories of colonialism, end of quote. Inevitably, critical terms and concepts come in and out of use in academia. My own critical vocabulary, including that of postmodernity, that I myself also drew from in the 1990s, is no doubt not the same today. But what noting the lessened critical relevance of postmodernity made me consider was which term and critical concept might be taking its place today to effectively articulate a broader critique of modernity and of modernist agendas, which certainly remain alive and well in today's global transformations. And I think Cynn's paper spoke to some of these. So there's perhaps no one such term, but several candidates. Yet in my field of Latin American and Caribbean studies, in recent years, the decolonial has prominently taken on the role of signaling a broader critique of modernity. Walter Mignolo is probably nowadays the most prominent exponent of the decolonial in Latin American studies, whose aim is, quote, not looking for alternative modernities, but for alternatives to modernity. In his book, which I just quoted from, The Darkest Side of Western Modernity, Global Futures, Decolonial Options, the search for an alternative to modernity becomes an, quote, invitation to organize and reinscribe communal systems all over the world that have been erased and dismantled, end of quote. Yet Mignolo is notably unwilling to consider any gendered and sexualized power differentials in these to be recuperated communal systems. Western modernity and colonial imperial difference, according to Mignolo, were what created, quote, a system that imposed the concept of women to reorganize gender-sexual relations in the European colonies, effectively introducing regulations for normal relations among the sexes and the hierarchical distinctions between man and woman. The colonial system invented also the categories homosexual and heterosexual, just as it invented the category man and woman. This invention makes homophobia relevant for describing Maya, Aztec, or Inca civilizations, describing Maya, Aztec, or Inca civilizations, then gender sexual organizations were cast in different categories. There was no homophobia, as indigenous people did not think in these type of categories. And partially I agree. It is true that indigenous people in Latin America did not use the same gender and sexual categories that we use today, but this does not mean that their own categories related to what we today describe as gender and sexuality did not involve power differentials, as most academic work on Latin American pre-colonial gender and sexuality readily recognizes and describes. thus taking the communal, and specifically the pre-colonial communal, as if it had remained ever the same up until today, and we did not have to worry about issues of gender and sexuality or anything related to it, as a starting point for thinking about alternatives to modernity and suspending, hence, the question of gender and sexuality in this communal or decolonial alternative makes, for me at least, such a critical proposal problematic from the very outset. Indeed, I find that gender and sexuality remain stubbornly unthought in the critical alternatives developed in the field of Latin American cultural theory, not only among the decolonial proponents, but also those of another theoretical corner associated with the concept of post-hegemony, linked to names such as Alberto Moreiras, Gareth Williams, John Beasley Murray, and others, which I don't have time to go into here. Furthermore, these current uses of the decolonial notably evade the earlier work of Chicana feminists such as Chela Sandoval and Emma Perez and others on the decolonial. The latter, in fact, Emma Perez, published a book titled The Decolonial Imaginary, Writing Chicanas into History in 1999. But neither Perez nor Sandoval are cited or appear in Magnolos' work on the decolonial. Perez, in her book, specifically formulates a theory of the decolonial imaginary as a tool to uncover, quote, the voices of Chicanas that have been relegated to silences, end of quote. It seems to me that the current uses of the decolonial in my field, specifically in Latin American studies, have resulted in a renewed set of gendered silences. And it makes me wonder, why do more sweeping conceptual tools such as the decolonial, the post-colonial, and post-modernity still so often have such trouble integrating gender and sexuality? And what we end up doing is having to repurpose them, as you were describing earlier today. Scaling down the theoretical scope, I asked myself then much more specifically about what transnational feminisms rooted in and routed through the Dominican Republic might offer as critical alternatives or pathways. The Dominican Republic recently made international headlines for its Supreme Court's egregious ruling that threatens to potentially strip many Haitian immigrants and Dominicans of Haitian origin and others of foreign origin of their citizenship in the country. Among those who have taken on the most vocal role critiquing this ruling, as well as previous ones, are Dominican women of Haitian origin, often mothers and students. Their protests tend to be made in strongly nationalist terms, arguing for how they are fully and properly Dominican and not Haitian, which, given that they have to answer to the strongly nationalist and anti-Haitian dogma that informs this ruling, makes this an understandable and strategic choice. In fact, looking back, it is evident that historically Dominican women's activism, particularly at its most transnational moments, often involved negotiating with the state and making demands by drawing both from nationalist discourses and modernizing paradigms. This collusion of modernity, nationalism, and feminism speaks to Grewal and Kaplan's insistence in Scattered Hegemonies that, quote, an examination of modernity is an important part of transnational feminist practices, and because modernity has participated predominantly within discourses of the formation of nation states, we feel that nationalism needs to be examined in relation to feminist practice, end of quote. They then furthermore suggest that, quote, when modernity takes shape as feminism, therefore it collaborates with nationalism. In its nationalist guise, it cannot be oppositional, end of quote. It is the latter assertion that I started wondering about, just because how women's forms of organizing with strong transnational dimensions in the Dominican Republic, especially in the 1920s and 30s and in the 1990s and 2000s, so very often drew both from the language of modernity and modernist agendas as well as nationalist guises. Some of this was certainly very conservative organizing, but not all of it. So I'm wondering, is their activism thereby inherently voided of all possible oppositionality, or may there be small oppositional maneuvering spaces created via these nationalist and modernist guises that are worth valuing? Understanding key moments of transnational feminism in the Dominican Republic means understanding how women acted within local hegemonic formations that have been strongly shaped by the double-edged sword of what Magnolo terms the so-called darker and presumably more enlightened side of Western modernity, of confronting Euro-North American imperialism and racist beliefs, as well as the Western political and social ideals that clothed them. However unrealized these proclaimed political and social ideals actually were in Western Europe and North America. What Dominican Transnational Feminist Organizing suggests to me is thus a need to still better understand and theorize the hegemonic formations created at the uneven junctures of modernity's so-called darker and presumably more enlightened side, and the anti-hegemonic challenges these may engender. Indeed, it is at such junctures and the forms of the resistance that they can give rise to that seems to me to be critically at work, at least in some of the global transformations that we're seeing today. Thank you.
I want to reiterate my panelists' thanks to the organizers and, of course, to my intellectual aunties over here, as Karen called them, not me. My paper's title, and I think hopefully you'll find it bookends well with Abby's paper because it's also about the academy, is Why Do Globalized Higher Education Debates Need Transnational Feminist Perspectives? In this paper, I'm going to be discussing aspects of my new project, which is an ethnography of American branch campuses in Qatar. In this project, which is still in its early stages, develops out of and builds on insights from my first book, Impossible Citizens, Dubai's Indian Diaspora, which explores the conflicting and multiple narratives and practices of belonging and citizenship by Indians in Dubai, who are in many ways permanently temporary because they do not have access to legal citizenship. This involves understanding the multiple logics of citizenship and governance, liberal, non-liberal, and neoliberal, that circulate within the Gulf states among its various residents, institutions, and spaces. During the course of conducting fieldwork in Dubai, I encountered several South Asian young people who had attended or were attending new American or American-style universities that were beginning to proliferate in the Gulf, and I'm sure you're aware of many of these. These young people who often found themselves interacting with Gulf nationals for the first time in their lives at these campuses articulated to me forms of citizenship and identity that differed from my other informants' narratives. This indicated a growing politicization around what many of these young people themselves called their second-class citizenship in the UAE. I became interested in what impacts American institutions of higher education were having on Gulf societies, particularly on foreign residents who do not have access to citizenship and national and permanency, and on women who were entering into gender integrated spaces, often for the first time in their lives. I chose Qatar as my research site because of its large branch campus initiative, Education City. Situated on the outskirts of Doha, Qatar's capital, Education City houses branch campuses of 6 top American universities: Northwestern, Georgetown, Cornell, Carnegie Mellon, Texas A&M, and Virginia Commonwealth. The sprawling compound, which continues to grow and add new educational offerings, is a multi-billion-dollar investment by the government of Qatar, intended to grow the country's knowledge economy in order to diversify away from the finite petroleum wealth that has been the mainstay of the country's economy since the mid-20th century. The state's hope is that an indigenous knowledge economy will in turn produce more skilled Qatari citizens for the workforce, thereby also reducing the country's heavy reliance on foreign workers, who currently constitute over 85% of the population, and that's actually a conservative estimate. This practice, called Qatarization, is official state policy and is actively promoted in multiple ways. Companies are offered incentives to incorporate more Qataris, and Qataris receive preferential treatment in many educational and hiring processes. The increase over the last decade in higher education options, particularly through Education City's American universities, also enables more Qatari women who have not traditionally attended college in high numbers to professionalize and work outside the home. In fact, Qatari women are considered essential to the success of Qatarization, since citizens comprise such a small minority of the country's population. Qatar's American universities, therefore, are meant primarily to be an investment in a type of knowledge economy that fosters nativist national identity and Qatarization. However, because they are imagined and administered as extensions of their home campuses in the United States, Education City's American universities are underpinned by Western liberal ideologies, namely multiculturalism, egalitarianism, secularism, democracy, and liberal feminism, that do not always match up with Qatari understandings of national futures and traditional values. These ideologies manifest in several key ways, including gender-integrated classrooms, English-only education, curricula that foster critical thinking on topics like religion and sexuality, student clubs and student government, and a large population of non-citizen students and employees. In fact, the last time I was there was only one Qatari faculty member who was a full-time faculty member, and only a handful of Qataris in the higher administration of Education City institutions. And non-Qataris comprise more than 50% of the student body at most schools. Because the Qatari government has designed Education City to provide American education, recruited primarily Americans to fill key positions, and looked to the United States as a source of expertise for the growth of an indigenous knowledge economy, the project has heightened local concerns about too much Western influence, which might result in the loss of Arabic language, Muslim values, and traditional Qatari social relations, particularly related to gender. All of these tensions and debates about higher education in Qatar seem to revolve around a critical paradox embedded within Education City itself, that it is through liberal education that non-liberal visions of national futures can be achieved. For the purposes of today's discussion and this conference, I want to focus specifically on how liberal feminism as a value has in many ways been mainstreamed into American higher education, as well as into the debates around globalized higher education occurring in the US and other Western countries. As Karen and others discussed this morning, and as Abby just explored in her paper, elitism and exclusion is structurally part of the academy in its original instantiation. And today we continue, as we've been speaking about all day, to experience it in our marked bodily movements through the spaces of academe, through the shifting structure of academic labor, and in the ways our work is legible or illegible to certain audiences. However, particular nostalgic mythologies of the university as an idealized space circulate in academic lamentations of the new corporate globalized higher education form, particularly in the critiques many faculty have made of branch campuses and other partnership ventures with non-liberal states. I am interested in exploring what is elided in these critiques and how my work can interrupt or intervene in some of the stories we tell ourselves about academe's past, present, and future, even as we are deeply impacted by our own inequalities and changes in our own institutional and disciplinary spaces. Between 2010 and 2012, I worked as a visiting faculty member at Texas A&M Qatar for 3 summers, and I conducted preliminary interviews for the project, including with several Qatari women students in Education City. Our conversations often began with their families' reasons for choosing Education City over the national university, which teaches both in Arabic and English and is gender segregated and also does not allow non-nationals, and their experiences of interacting with men and with non-nationals within the Education City spaces themselves. In addition, we discussed their professors, the campus culture, and the curriculum. Some of these women were former students of mine, so sometimes we discussed classroom moments that impacted them. Most often, these moments had to do with topics related to gender or to migration. In her dissertation about Weill Cornell Medical School, Qatar, Tanya Kane has written about how Muslim Cornell students developed a sense of in-between identity. They needed to operate within a secular, westernized medical school culture and discourse on campus, which includes lessons on anatomy, the use of cadavers, and even learning detailed language about sexuality and alcoholism, for example, while returning to what they considered traditional gender roles within the home. Many Qatari women, in fact, told Kane that they felt impure or like sluts for knowing such intimate details about men's bodies and about sex. However, Qatari women were also empowered by the education they received, had nationalist visions for their role in the country's future, and were eager to have careers outside the home upon graduation. In my own interviews, Qatari women similarly felt that attending university in Education City provided them with opportunities and outlooks that they would not otherwise have had. Sarah, for example, who was entering her senior year at TAMU-Q, Texas A&M Qatar, told me that what she liked best about the American university was that it centered on, quote, structure, professionalism, and objectivity, a phrasing that represented her internalization of a particular form of neoliberal citizenship that she encountered within Education City. She now not only had the skills, but also the confidence to work side by side with her male compatriots. In addition, she felt her role in her future marriage and family would change from this experience, saying, "It gives you the confidence and the ability to say that, well, men want things, I want things too. It's not just like only them that have to be superior, whatever. It's also us. If you are aware of that and you tell your parents that, then you will be the person who is leading the marriage process, instead of being just the one who is doing things for others." Correspondingly, faculty that had been at TAMU-Q for several years noticed a profound change between men's and women's interactions, both inside and outside of the classroom. While in the first years of the university's existence, and these universities have been around probably about a decade, men and women would self-segregate, and conservative Qatari parents still predominantly chose to send their children, especially their daughters, to the segregated public Qatar University. Classrooms at TAMU-Q now have more men and women sitting together instead of like self-segregating within the classroom and interacting than ever, and outreach efforts have brought in students from more conservative families. Cross-gender socialization and teamwork have also become more comfortable and commonplace in the hallways and student organizations of the university, and are actively fostered by student affairs and by individual staff and faculty as core citizenship outcome goals. In many ways, these efforts are indicators of the ways in which notions of gender equality have been mainstreamed into American university administration and into the curriculum. However, there are other gendered questions that are not being asked, or not being asked in a way that explores the specificity of the Qatari Gulf context. This is where I believe a transnational perspective can be useful. Let me provide one ethnographic illustration. In my summer 2011 Introduction to Sociocultural Anthropology class at Texas A&M Qatar, on a day when we were discussing gender roles, and I, not being quite aware of some of the social mores there yet, had assigned Emily Martin's Sperm and the Egg article, okay? So here, this is, so it was a really fun day. The young Qatari women in my class were extremely vocal about their opinions about gender inequality in Qatar. They were all on board with this article, and the men were very, very angry. And they directly criticized what they felt were sexist claims made by some, primarily Qatari men in the class. My colleagues at Texas A&M Qatar would not have expected these visible shifts in gender interaction. And so, like, I had a moment where, like, the women were you know, directly turning around and like, yelling at the men and critiquing the men. And so this was a very interesting moment where I hadn't seen this kind of interaction between them. And my colleagues would not have expected these visible shifts in gender interaction even 2 years ago at TAMU-Q. These could be regarded as moments of success when seen from the perspective of American ideas of gender equality and integration within the classroom. However, these events cannot easily be co-opted into the language of mainstream US feminism, for Qatari women's definitions of gender equality were framed less in terms of liberal democratic access to rights and civil society, but more as calls for extending the responsibilities of the patrimonial non-liberal welfare state to include women more expansively, an extension that relied directly upon excluding the large non-citizen majority to support the heavy welfare benefits provided to the citizen minority. For example, many of my Qatari women students felt it was unfair that male expatriates were given job preference over them, though this claim was not necessarily backed up by fact. They expressed unease about moving around in spaces that were occupied by low-wage, mostly South Asian, foreign resident males. And they were angry about having to leave their children with foreign housemaids because husbands did not do an equal share of domestic work. Thus, equality, democracy, and freedom, applied from a liberal feminist perspective, fails to account for the particularities through which Qatari women were deploying these terms, and in fact, claiming their grievances against the state and their male compatriots as moments of feminist liberation or academic success also means being complicit in the alienation of non-citizen groups and the power and labor hierarchies within which they live their daily lives. Within academic circles, branch campuses in non-liberal or non-democratic contexts have been highly criticized, particularly by faculty, also through the language of liberal feminism. For example, many have argued against partnering with states that have sexist or homophobic discrimination built into their legal systems, claiming that this would be a hindrance to academic freedom and erode the values of the Western academy. There are, in fact, very few voices from academics themselves in support of such ventures, and most see them as administrative projects that exemplify negative changes in the university structure over the last few decades. My approach to these questions comes from an altogether different starting point. Instead of beginning from the point of the American university in the United States, or in an abstract, idealized, nostalgic form, I begin with the on-the-ground experiences of those who interact with, produce, and are impacted by branch campuses in the Gulf states themselves. I argue that a local ethnography of the branch campus needs to precede any top-down arguments about the virtues and vices of globalized higher education in the Gulf, arguments that ironically often rely upon facile and Orientalist understandings of Gulf governments, people, and politics in order to argue against American neocolonialism in the region, or what is perceived as American neocolonialism in the region. These criticisms also venture dangerously close to moral judgments and civilizational discourse about which places in the world are ready for American-style education and which places are not yet on a yardstick of development to deserve such institutions. It might be important for us to remember in our current discussions of a university in crisis or ruins that the language of crisis was also used when women wanted to enter the Western Academy, and when programs like ethnic studies and cultural studies fought and continue to fight for legitimization. What exactly are we losing through internationalization of our universities, and which actors are centered and which marginalized in the language of loss and gain? Conversations about the future of higher education and the potential negative impacts of US universities on Gulf societies are also rife in the classrooms, hallways, and social spaces of higher education within the Gulf Arab states themselves, but from a perspective where the American university signifies a different type of crisis, a different loss, one that destabilizes autochthonous understandings of Arabian Gulf history, language, and identity. The interactions between these opposing frameworks of eroding cultural values are creating new and interesting reassemblages that I hope to explore further as I continue this research. We might be wise to remember then in our discussions of the positives and negatives of allowing American higher education into the Gulf and into Singapore and into China and other places, that we are in the midst of some of the greatest political action in the Middle East region, democratic or pseudo-democratic participation that is deeply connected to some of the most visible grassroots American activism in recent years, like the Occupy movement. The linkages between student protests at UC Davis, for example, and other college campuses in the US, and the conversations that happen in a classroom in Doha, Qatar, are not so far removed. And perhaps it is in the potential conversations between students, faculty, staff, in these seemingly disparate places that new, as yet unimagined forms of public good are possible, even within this seemingly overwhelming climate that we've been talking about of neoliberal academic globalization. Thank you.
My question is for Abby and Neha, and it's in relation to the global university. I'm wondering, Abby, you mentioned basically the reductive approach that assumes the irrelevance of the nation to the globalization of the university. And I don't know, well, you talked about Wellesley, so I'm not sure if you know about the partnership between Peking University and Wellesley that was started in June 2013. And so I'll tell you a little bit about it. So it is basically modeled after Madeleine Albright Institute's Global Leadership for Women. So a group of students, around 50 or so, were taken to Peking University, and then they're going to have the same number of students from Peking University, female students, female-bodied students, coming to Wellesley. And basically the goal is to kind of develop relations between China and the US, and also global leadership for women and so on and so forth. But something really interesting happened after that, which was that Professor Shah, who was teaching at Wellesley but also was a professor at Peking University, was fired because of his political views. And so there was this havoc. There were petitions written. I can't tell you how many faculty councils were over fights that we should boycott Peking University, and it was put very much in the context of freedom of speech. And this is basically in a sense, violation of freedom of speech of Professor Shah, and we have to boycott. Of course, our president refused to sign something like this, saying that if I do this, I have to basically have the same standard for other boycotts. But it was interesting that after the ASA basically passed the BDS, the boycott and divestment from Israel, our president wrote, apparently I just learned about it actually, that a few weeks ago wrote a statement saying that we are against the boycott of Israel, and this is basically a violation of freedom of speech. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, both of you, in terms of the globalization of the university in relationship to geopolitics, and which places basically can have, or some of which you talked about a little bit, Neha, where in what places can American university basically have branches, who's ready for that, but also other than that, the kind of geopolitics of it. Is a question?
Yeah. Actually, Abby and I were having this conversation yesterday. Do you want to go first, or should I go first?
But the one point I would make is a kind of thing I come back to all the time, which is historicizing, right? So American-style universities are not a new thing.
Yeah.
So if we think about the American University of Beirut, the American University of Cairo, I believe American University in Beirut goes back to like the 1860s.
Yeah, it was missionary.
1870s. Yeah, so it's, really old. This is, I guess, kind of the lesson of my work, I guess, is that we need to take lessons and understand this history in order to kind of understand the present, and kind of critically engage what's going on based on lessons we already kind of know. We just need to kind of go back and think about them. So that would be my first point. But
yeah. Okay, so let me just tell you this really interesting vignette. We don't have time? Okay, all right. Well, Texas A&M is in talks to start a Peace University in Bethlehem. In I don't know, but in Israel, okay? And it's run by Christian evangelicals and all this kind of stuff. That kind of thing has not gotten even traction or pushback or anything like that. And I think that I think you're absolutely dead on, Seema, because this has a lot to do with geopolitics. It also has a lot to do with the ways in which certain countries circulate in our academic discourse as like the bad states versus the good states, right? I mean, I think you're really dead on that, and particularly this academic freedom. I'm really working on trying to connect the ASA stuff with the way in which academic freedom as a discourse circulates through these kinds of critiques.
And one other point I make with that is also what kind of bad state, and how can the university be the recuperative, right? And especially when the university works with the state and with capital, which is why like Qatar is such a good example, and all of the kind of Gulf state universities. It's a way of recuperating states that are otherwise kind of frowned upon, right, as being not progressive enough. This can mark that.
I think my question specifically goes to Maja Horn. I'm interested in what you were saying about nationalistic construction of feminist movement and double-edged sword when it is introduced to transnational feminist activism. How do you respond to, in the morning, Gruel was talking about USA consumer culture, and United States becomes necessary for humanitarian citizenship. And for example, this kind of conference and globalization of university, I mean, this kind of organization becomes a medium for nationalist feminist movement or activism. I see a lot of women, comfort women survivor in East Asian countries, for example, South Korea, they travel to a lot of USA universities to, give their confession, the stories about how they survived out of colonialization of, like Japanese colonialism back then. So it's more like, they are constructing nationalist implication behind it in the name of transnational feminism in the United States. So I see the irony in between these two movements, and how do you respond to that kind of dilemma? I mean, we are talking a lot about globalization and transnationalist feminist movement, but inside within it, when you are looking at it, there's a lot of modernist construction of nationalist feminist activism within it. It's kind of redundant issue, I think. And how do you respond to that in terms of your Dominican Republic case?
I think I'm not entirely sure I have a full response to how I would respond to that. I think the first step that I kind of took in this paper is like noting it and seeing that there are particular uses of the modern and of the nation state made by different kind of organizations. And some places that we would expect it more, so let's say NGOs, the state, nationalist group, but also by groups that I would not consider particularly conservative women's organizations. And so, and that's where I was trying to push a little bit, I guess a little bit against this idea that maybe that inherently must render non-oppositional everything that they do. I feel that there's these moments of complicity, but also moments of resistance and challenges, and it's very hard to decide this organization is, because it's using this language to push, let's say, a particular project, right? So they might use this language to talk about domestic violence, but there is a completely different language that might be used for something else, like a local project with access to water. There might be something different. Actually, they will probably use the language of modernity for that too, but there are different, it's very hard for me to, so it was very hard for me to sort of take the modern out and at the same time, it's just a very relevant term, and I would make that argument that in the, at least in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and in Latin America, which is what my background is, the term of the modern and modernity has been a very important category. So I feel like I have to grapple with that in multiple kind of ways. So I don't see my way around it. That's where I've arrived at. Like I have to see, I see forms of activism that I would consider oppositional that work with the modern in sometimes more or less problematic ways.
I was going to ask if Christine or Magdalena wanted to respond to that question in any way, to think through that one.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, I mean, I'm not an Africanist or African studies person by training, but I think that in sub-Saharan Africa and the constitution of African studies as a field as well, the category of the modern has been central. And it actually emerged initially as a kind of oppositional discourse explicitly, right, against claims that Africa's traditional outside history, right, is outside the modern, has no history, in fact, right? So, and then there have been various, and then it's sort of come full circle again, where people are actually claiming that exclusion from modernity explains the conditions of precarity of people who live on the continent, which seems almost paradoxical, right? But there have been many, many other arguments in between that seeming circle. So, I mean, I would agree that the category of the modern does all kinds of work in different contexts and can be defined as oppositional when mobilized in certain contexts to certain ends, but then might have effects that are unanticipated as well, right? And has to be tracked with careful attention to historical context, to right, to the moment, to how it was. Even the comfort woman example, right? The Korean state is interested in those claims, right, for its own ends, which don't necessarily intersect with those of what you termed transnational feminism, right? So,
well, thank you so much for a terrific panel, and please join me in thanking.